We would like to take a moment to thank Factor for supporting today's episode. Do you want to get chef-prepared meals on the table in 2 minutes? I know I do. Head to factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's factormeals.com/cold50 and the code is COLD50. Enjoy the show. September 25th, 1966. Bridgetown, Ohio. After he's seen taking out the garbage, 28-year-old Jerry Bricca returns to his residence, where he lives with his 23-year-old wife Linda Bricca and their 4-year-old daughter Debbie. 2 days later, the entire family is found murdered as they were each stabbed to death inside their respective bedrooms. Police begin to suspect Fred Leininger, a local veterinarian whom Linda worked for and was rumored to be having an affair with, but there is not enough evidence to implicate him, and the Bricca family murders are never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and on today's episode, we're going to be exploring an horrific triple homicide, the 1966 murders of the Bricca family. I've received numerous requests to cover this case, as it involves a couple named Jerry and Linda Bricca, who were both murdered alongside their 4-year-old daughter Debbie inside their home in a seemingly safe suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Each victim was stabbed multiple times, and since there were no signs of forced entry and robbery did not appear to be the motive for the crime, police always suspected that the family may have known their killer. Over the years, investigators would explore a number of different theories and potential suspects, but the only individual they could not eliminate was a veterinarian named Fred Leininger. On the surface, Leininger did not seem to be a likely candidate to commit a brutal homicide like this, as he was a married man with children of his own, but in the days preceding the crime, he hired Linda to be a receptionist at his animal hospital, and rumors circulated that they were having an affair. However, this was never conclusively proven, and Leininger stopped speaking to the police, so they were never able to amass enough evidence to charge him or anyone else with the murders. In 2018, true crime author/historian J.T. Townsend published a book about this case titled Summer's Almost Gone, which not only extensively covered this case, but provided an overview of a terrifying crime wave which pervaded the Cincinnati area during that time period, as the city was also dealing with a serial killer known as the Cincinnati Strangler. The book contained a lot of information about the Bricca murders which had never been released to the public before, so it will be one of the primary sources on today's episode. Even though nearly 60 years have passed, the case remains open, and law enforcement is still actively investigating it in hopes that there might be a resolution someday. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the Bricca family murders. Our story takes place in 1966 in Bridgetown, Ohio, a suburb of Cincinnati located in Green Township. Our victims are 28-year-old Jerry Bricca, who goes by the name Jerry, his 23-year-old wife Linda Bricca, and their 4-year-old daughter Debbie. Jerry was born in San Francisco, California, and after graduating from Stanford University with a Bachelor of Sciences in Chemical Engineering, he was hired to work for the Agrochemical and Agricultural Biotechnology Corporation, Monsanto. He was soon transferred to Seattle, Washington to work as a chemical engineer at their Monsanto branch, but while on a United Airlines flight, he became acquainted with a stewardess named Linda Bulaw. Linda originally hailed from the village of Barrington Hills, Illinois, and had just recently completed a flight attendant training school, and she soon became involved in a relationship with Jerry. However, Linda was soon terminated from her job by United Airlines after she became nauseous on one of her flights, and it became apparent that she was suffering from morning sickness because she was pregnant. In November of 1961, after being together for only 4 months, Jerry and Linda got married, and in June of 1962, their daughter Debbie was born. After Jerry received a new transfer at his job, the Bricca family relocated to Ohio in July of 1963 and moved into a 3-story suburban home on Greenway Road in the Woodhaven subdivision of Bridgetown. At this particular point, Jerry is employed at the Monsanto Plastics facility in Addiston, another suburb of Cincinnati located about 11 miles from the Bricca residence, but he is known for working long hours and garnering a considerable amount of overtime while Linda takes care of Debbie. As a result, it seems apparent that the Bricca's marriage is not in a good place, as earlier this year, Linda traveled to Florida with Debbie in order to spend some time with her maternal grandparents, but later admitted that the trip was a trial separation from Jerry. In spite of this, there are some signs that things might get better for the couple. Linda was not happy living in Bridgetown, as she did not fit in with the other residents, but Jerry has recently interviewed for a position with Standard Oil at their office in San Francisco, and they have given him a verbal offer for a new job, which is set to begin in October. And since Linda has always had a passion for helping animals, she has recently taken on a part-time job working as a receptionist at the Glenway Animal Hospital. On the morning of Sunday, September the 25th, Jerry went to the Monsanto Plastics facility as it was common practice for him to work on the weekends. A few hours later, Jerry left the facility to attend a morning mass at his church and went home for lunch, before returning to the plant to work a few more hours until he clocked out at 4:25 p.m. By 6:45, Jerry had gone back home, and he received a phone call from a co-worker named Glenn Ritchie, who was planning to accompany Jerry on a business trip to visit the Monsanto plant in Nitro, West Virginia, the following morning. Since their flight was scheduled to leave at 8:15 a.m., Jerry told Glenn that he would pick him up and drive him to the airport at 6:30 before the end of their call. At 8:45 p.m., Jerry was seen purchasing 3 gallons of milk and a quart of orange juice at a nearby United Dairy Farmers store where the Briccas were known to be regular customers. Shortly thereafter, at around 9 o'clock, one of the Briccas' neighbors saw Jerry taking some trash cans out of his residence and placing them at the curb for pickup in the morning, but unfortunately, this turned out to be the last time anyone from the Bricca family was confirmed to be alive. At 6:30 a.m. on Monday, September the 26th, Jerry did not show up as planned to pick up Glenn Ritchie, and even though Glenn phoned the Bricca residence 3 times, no one answered. Since Glenn just assumed that Jerry had overslept, he traveled to the airport on his own and boarded his flight to West Virginia, but when he returned home later that day and tried calling Jerry again, there was still no answer. Indeed, even though Jerry's Volkswagen remained parked outside his residence, no one saw or heard from him, Linda, or Debbie the entire day, and all phone calls to them went unanswered. Concerns started to mount when Jerry failed to show up at the Monsanto plant on Tuesday, September the 27th, and did not call in, which was very uncharacteristic of him. By the time nightfall hit, the Bricca's neighbors noticed that Jerry's Volkswagen was still parked outside his residence, and even though there did not appear to be any lights on inside the house, the exterior back patio light had been left on for 2 straight days. In addition, the Bricca's empty trash cans were still resting on the curb and had not been brought back into the house after the Monday morning pickup, and a stack of newspapers which had been delivered the previous 2 days were still in the front yard. Finally, at around 10:15 p.m., 4 of the Bricca's neighbors decided to pay a visit to the house, and after receiving no answers to repeated knocks, they noticed that the front door was unlocked and decided to open it. Even though the family's television set was located inside a room on the lower level, it could be heard playing at a very loud volume. One of the neighbors was Richard Meyer, a World War II veteran who had seen combat, and he would later say that the moment he opened the door, he immediately recognized the smell of decomposing bodies. So before the group did anything else, they immediately phoned the Green Township Police Department. When police arrived at the residence and went into the master bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Jerry and Linda on the floor. Jerry was lying face down, and Linda was lying face up on top of his body. Jerry was stabbed a total of 9 times in the back and neck, and he had facial contusions to indicate he had been beaten. Linda had a total of 10 knife wounds in her chest, neck, and head, and since there was a huge blood stain on the bed, she had likely been stabbed there before her body wound up on the floor on top of her husband. Based on the accounts of witnesses who had seen him, it was determined that Jerry was still dressed in the same clothing he had been wearing on September the 25th, and he also had a pair of socks in his mouth, which had likely been held in place by a piece of adhesive tape which was dangling from Jerry's chin. Linda was dressed in a nightgown and housecoat, but her breasts were exposed, and the left one was sporting 6 stab wounds. Police soon walked into Debbie's bedroom and discovered her body was also on the floor. She was stabbed a total of 4 times, and some of the stab wounds were so deep that they managed to go all the way through her body. The positioning of her body in the middle of the room suggested that she had been hiding in the closet or underneath the bed prior to her murder, and a stuffed animal was on the floor a few feet away from her. Debbie was dressed in pajamas and a robe and wearing one knee-length sock while the other sock was lying on her bed. There were no signs of any forced entry at the residence, as both the front and back doors were still unlocked, and like I mentioned earlier, the rear porch light had been left on for 2 straight days. There was no sign of struggle or destruction inside any of the rooms, and none of the victims had defensive wounds. The Briccas owned a pair of dogs named Thumper and Daisy, but no one in the neighborhood recalled hearing any barking from them the previous 2 days. The dogs were found inside the lower-level TV room, and while neither of them were physically harmed, they barely reacted to the police presence and practically seemed to be comatose. This has led to speculation that the killer may have drugged the dogs prior to committing the murders, but it's worth noting that no forensic testing was ever performed to determine if they had any drugs in their system. But rest assured, Thumper and Daisy both survived this ordeal and were placed into the custody of Linda's mother. Even though all the drawers in the master bedroom had been pulled open, the scene appeared to have been staged in order to give off the false impression that a burglary took place. No valuable items were stolen from the residence, and even though Jerry's wallet was lying on top of his bed and was empty, no one knew how much money had been in there. The Briccas owned a carving knife set which they kept in the dining room, and it was found inside an open drawer. It appeared that one of the knives from this set was missing, and since it could not be found, investigators believed that it was likely the murder weapon. There was also an odd discrepancy with the pile of newspapers found in the Briccas' yard, because even though they contained the Monday afternoon, Tuesday morning, and Tuesday afternoon editions of the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Monday morning edition was missing. The newspaper carrier would later tell police that he was certain he delivered the Monday morning edition at around 2:15 a.m. on the 26th, so this led to speculation that the killer may have still been inside the house at that point and later picked up the paper in order to wrap up the missing carving knife. They then placed the wrapped up knife inside the trash cans by the curb, and the garbage collectors then picked up the murder weapon later that morning without even realizing it. Indeed, it appeared that the killer had remained inside the residence for a considerable length of time following the murders, and may have gone to the trouble of attempting to clean the place before they left. Shortly after the discovery of the bodies, the Green Township PD summoned the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office to the Bricca residence for assistance, and the investigation would eventually be taken over by the Cincinnati Police Department. Unfortunately, since word immediately spread about the murders, a number of outsiders, including the Mac Volunteer Fire Department, wound up going inside the Bricca residence before it could be sealed off as a crime scene, and they may have contaminated or destroyed potential evidence. A lot of physical evidence was collected from the scene, including some cigarette butts which likely belonged to an outsider, since Jerry and Linda did not smoke. However, much of the evidence was not properly stored and preserved, and wound up degrading over time. Since Jerry was found wearing his regular clothing, and Linda and Debbie were wearing night clothes, it was theorized that the family was preparing for bed when they were murdered. The crime may have also taken place shortly after Jerry was seen taking out the garbage at 9 p.m., as neighbors would report noticing that the Bricca residence back door was wide open at around 9:15, and odd thumping noises could be heard from the house between then and 9:30. An autopsy would reveal that Linda had semen inside her body, but since she was found with her underwear still on, and there were no obvious signs of sexual assault, it could not be determined if Linda had been raped by the killer, or if she had simply had consensual sex in the 24 to 36 hours prior to her death. While DNA testing was not a thing back in 1966, they were still able to determine that the semen belonged to someone who had a different blood type than Jerry, which suggested that Linda may have willingly had sex with another man. During the initial investigation, over 300 people were interviewed and looked at as potential suspects. Weeks after the crime took place, the authorities announced that only one of these individuals could not be eliminated as a suspect, but he was no longer cooperating and, quote-unquote, hiding behind an attorney. They never publicly released this suspect's name, and it would not be until several decades later when it was revealed that he was a 35-year-old veterinarian named Fred Leininger. At the time of the murders, Dr. Leininger was married and had 5 children with his wife, Lynn Leininger, and owned the Glenway Animal Hospital, where Linda just happened to be working as a part-time receptionist. Linda had been taking her dogs to the clinic since November of 1963, but since she always had a passion for helping animals, she had been apparently inquiring about getting a part-time job there for quite some time. Well, when Linda went to the clinic to pay a bill on Monday, September the 19th, 6 days before her death, she learned that Leininger now had a job opening, and he proceeded to give her an impromptu interview. He was hoping to hire someone who could live in the clinic's apartment and work as the caretaker and receptionist, so he asked Linda if she would be willing to temporarily take on the receptionist position until he found someone else, and she enthusiastically agreed. Linda started working at the clinic later that night, and Leininger soon found a married couple named Stephen and Valinda Westman, who each agreed to take on the live-in caretaker and receptionist positions and move into the clinic's apartment. But Leininger also arranged to give the couple Wednesdays off, and on the morning of Saturday, September the 24th, he phoned the Bricca residence to let Linda know he was going to hire her to work as his receptionist every Wednesday for the rest of the year. However, given that the Bricca's marriage did not appear to be a happy one, rumors had circulated throughout the community that Linda was having an extramarital affair with someone, and there was speculation that it could have been Leininger. On the evening of Wednesday, September the 21st, Linda was working at the Glenway Animal Hospital while Jerry was attending a stag party for one of his coworkers, so Linda arranged to leave Debbie with Betty Meyer, who happened to be the husband of Richard Meyer, one of the neighbors who would later discover the family's bodies. Even though the Glenway Animal Hospital closed at 9 p.m., over an hour passed without Linda picking up Debbie or calling to say she would be late. Finally, at around 10:20, Jerry arrived at the Meyer residence and angrily knocked on the door. When Betty answered, Jerry said he had just returned home and Linda was not there, so he wanted to know where she was. Jerry then said he was going to head over to the clinic to find Linda, but Betty managed to calm him down by offering him a drink, and Linda finally arrived a short time later. Linda claimed she was late because right before closing time, someone showed up to the clinic with a cat which had been hit by a car, but even though she stayed late to assist Dr. Leininger, he was unable to revive the animal before it died. Jerry became suspicious of this story and told Linda that he could smell whiskey on her breath, but she said she felt so despondent over the loss of the cat that Leininger pulled out a bottle of whiskey and suggested they have a drink together before she left. This made Jerry cry out, quote, "I should go over and beat him up," before the couple took Debbie and left the Meyer residence. The following day, on September the 22nd, Linda called another neighbor to ask if she could watch over Debbie from 7 until 9 p.m. that night because she said that Leininger had called her into work at the clinic at the last minute. However, this story didn't ring true, as investigators learned that the Glenway Animal Hospital was only open from 9 a.m. until noon on Thursdays. It also turned out that at around 7:15 p.m. on the evening of the 22nd, Linda made a phone call to an answering service for the clinic in which she left a message with an operator saying that it was very urgent for Dr. Fred Leininger to call her. After giving a preliminary statement to police shortly after the murders, Leininger was interviewed at the Glenway Animal Hospital on October the 8th by two detectives who later described him as being rather distant and aloof and not showing much shock or emotion about the murders. Leininger claimed that the last time he saw Linda in person was when she worked at the clinic on the evening of Wednesday the 21st. He also said that Linda later phoned the clinic to inform him that Debbie had left a book there during a previous visit, so after finding the book, Leininger paid a visit to the Bricca residence shortly before noon on Friday the 23rd. He claimed that Debbie was playing out in the front yard, so he gave her the book and left without going inside the house or speaking to her parents. Leininger said that his final communication with Linda was when he phoned her on the morning of Saturday the 24th to let her know she would be working as his receptionist every Wednesday. When asked about his whereabouts on the evening of September the 25th, during the approximate time period the murders took place, Leininger was unable to provide a solid alibi. He said that he may have been called into the clinic that night in order to treat an animal, but he wasn't entirely sure, and he never kept records of any treatments he performed on weekends. When detectives spoke to Stephen and Belinda Westman, the newly hired couple living in the clinic's apartment, they said that they had spent the 25th in Kentucky and returned to the clinic at around 6 p.m., but did not recall seeing Leininger there. In total, Leininger's interview lasted 45 minutes, but he denied detectives' request to provide him with samples of his blood, hair, and fingerprints. And when he was directly asked about the nature of his relationship with Linda, Leininger said he had an appointment coming up and was pressed for time, and abruptly terminated the interview. Well, suspicion started to mount against Leininger when detectives spoke to a friend of his named Robert Girton. At around 12:30 p.m. on Friday the 23rd, Girton said that he met Leininger for lunch at the Crescent Bowman Archery Club, but while they were there, a young woman suddenly showed up to join them. Leininger introduced her as, quote-unquote, Linda, the girl who was working for me, and after they finished their lunch, she proceeded to follow them around while they fired some shots on the archery range. Girton said that Leininger seemed to be visibly uncomfortable and nervous about the whole situation, but they eventually parted ways, and Girton left Leininger and the woman alone. A few days later, after Girton heard about the murders in the newspapers, Leininger told him that the girl he had seen at the archery range was Linda Bricca. Naturally, this story raised alarm bells with detectives, since Leininger never mentioned this encounter with Linda during his interview with them, and claimed that the last time he saw her was at his clinic on the evening of the 21st. Investigators also learned that between 12:30 and 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday the 24th, at least two witnesses saw Linda riding in a light gray or green car being driven by a man, and since Jerry was at work at Monsanto during this time period, the man could not have been him. One of the witnesses thought they saw the same car parked in the Bricca's driveway later that afternoon, and when shown a photo lineup, she identified the driver as Fred Leininger. Investigators became even more suspicious of Leininger when a liquor proprietor named Larry Foppe came forward. Foppe owned the High-Low Beverage Depot, which was located about a half mile from the Bricca residence, and claimed that at around 10:30 p.m. on the evening of the 25th, shortly after the murders were believed to have taken place, he saw a disheveled, unkempt man run into his store and ask to use the payphone. Foppe said the man's hands were shaking, and he seemed to have trouble getting through when he dialed the phone's number. When Foppe asked if everything was all right, the man hung up the phone and muttered something about an emergency call and being unable to get a hold of the party before he ran back outside. Foppe was certain that this man was Fred Leininger, as he was a regular customer who frequented the store about 3 to 4 times per week. Foppe found it unusual that Leininger did not even attempt to make conversation with him, and said he had not returned to the store since the murders took place. Shortly after the incident, Foppe drove home on Greenway Avenue and passed by the Bricca residence, but said that he noticed what appeared to be a small blue car parked in front of Jerry's Volkswagen outside his house. Detectives soon showed up at the Leininger residence in order to ask him some more questions, but his wife Lynn answered the door and gave them a business card for an attorney before informing them that all communication with her husband would have to go through the attorney. Leininger never spoke to the police again, and all of their attempts to arrange another interview through his attorney were unsuccessful. Getting back to Foppe's sighting of the blue car, it's worth noting that Leininger was driving a red Buick station wagon at that time, but about 45 minutes after Foppe's sighting at around 11:30 p.m., two other motorists driving on Greenway Avenue recalled seeing a white or green car parked in the same approximate spot in front of the Bricca residence where the blue car had been seen. The first witness said he saw a male who appeared to be in his early 20s climbing in through the driver's side door, while the second witness saw what he described as a frightened-looking young woman climbing into the vehicle through the passenger side with two male figures already in the front seat. All subsequent attempts to identify the woman and the two men went nowhere. Even though law enforcement frequently made statements to the press in which they mentioned an unnamed suspect who refused to cooperate with them, they lacked the evidence to charge him with anything, and the investigation eventually hit a brick wall and faded from the spotlight. However, it would later be revealed that police were able to obtain samples of Leininger's hair when a detective followed him to a restaurant and stole Leininger's hat from the cloakroom while he was eating. It's also been reported that a strand of unidentified hair was found clutched in Linda's right hand. In addition, investigators learned that the brand of adhesive tape found attached to Jerry's chin was medical tape often used in veterinarians' offices, though it could not be conclusively linked to Leininger. Since Leininger was never publicly named as a suspect, he was able to keep living a normal life and continued operating the Glenway Animal Hospital until 1995. Fred and his wife Lynn subsequently retired to Sarasota, Florida, but in February of 2004, there would be a shocking development. After driving from Sarasota back to Cincinnati, the Leiningers, who were both 73 years old at the time, decided to check into the Omni Netherland Plaza and apparently made a suicide pact as their bodies would soon be discovered on their bed inside their room. They were both dressed in bathrobes and had plastic bags tied over their heads, and they had also ingested morphine. While Fred was pronounced dead at the scene, Lynn was still alive and remained in a coma for over 9 months until she passed away on December the 7th. The couple were both dealing with health problems at the time, and Fred had been suffering from depression after losing money in the Enron scandal, but even though they left behind a suicide note, it made no mention of the Bricca murders. In December of 2018, J.T. Townsend published his aforementioned book about this case titled Summer's Almost Gone. At the time the murders took place, Townsend was a teenager living in Cincinnati and vividly remembered being terrified by the crime and developing an obsession with it. He described the book as being, quote-unquote, 52 years in the making, and since the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office granted him full access to the case file, he was able to share a lot of information about the original investigation which had never been made public before. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigation Section have confirmed that they still consider this to be an open and active cold case and do have physical evidence, including DNA. While the DNA has been run through the Combined DNA Index System database, it is not matched up with the DNA of any convicted offenders who have been entered into the system. So after nearly 60 years, the Bricca family murders continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a few moments to thank our sponsor, Factor. Summer is winding down, which means you want to spend as much time as possible doing fun things in the nice weather and not having your time monopolized by such tasks as preparing meals. So that's why I'd recommend fueling up with Factor's menu of no prep, no mess, chef-crafted meals. The meals are always fresh and never frozen, and dietitian approved, and they are also ready to eat in 2 minutes. So even if you're busy, you'll always have time to prepare nutritious, great-tasting meals and never have to utter the ominous words, I guess you could say, the meal went cold. There are over 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, which means you'll always have new flavors to explore and have effortless support for your lifestyle. You can choose from 6 menu preferences to help you manage calories, maximize protein intake, avoid meat, or simply eat well balanced. On our last ad, I discussed some of the meals I liked, but I also know someone else who recently received a box of Factor meals and described them as very good with very filling portions, and they particularly liked the variety of vegetarian options. Indeed, if you don't eat meat, you'll have a number of great options to choose from, such as the roasted veggie and pesto tortellini, which is topped with such vegetables as roasted cherry tomatoes, red bell peppers, zucchini, carrots, and yellow squash, with roasted green beans on the side. Another great recommendation is the smoky tofu and baked beans meal, which is sweetened with coconut sugar and macaroni topped with a rich and cheesy cheddar chili sauce. So head to factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. That's factormeals.com/cold50, and the code is COLD50 for 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So I've covered quite a few stories on this podcast in which entire families have been murdered, and they never cease to shock me. In most of these cases, it seems like one or more of the parents was the intended target, but the perpetrators show no hesitation about brutally murdering any children that were present. That's certainly the case here, as it's been theorized that the only reason that 4-year-old Debbie Bricca was killed was because she was a witness and may have recognized the killer. Yet the responsible parties showed no hesitation about stabbing her 4 times and piercing the child so deeply that the knife went all the way through her body. The police have always considered Fred Leininger to be the most likely suspect, and while I'm not going to necessarily say he's the killer just yet, let's operate under the assumption that he did this. There's been speculation that Leininger had been having an affair with Linda Bricca, and there are any number of possible reasons for why he might have killed Linda, her husband, and her child, such as him wanting to cover up the affair and protect his good standing in the community. But Leininger was a married man who had 5 children of his own, and no known history of violence, yet if he did this, he didn't seem to have any qualms about murdering a 4-year-old. He then continues to go on living his life, presumably without committing any more crimes, and while I'm sure there was gossip throughout the community about him being the killer, he was still able to keep operating his animal hospital for the next 3 decades and lived for another 37 years. Most people who knew Leininger said that he didn't appear to be the type of person who seemed capable of such a heinous crime, so how was he able to keep projecting such a mask of normalcy? But of course, before we start condemning Leininger, we have to explore all the possible scenarios in this case. I mentioned earlier that during the early stages of the investigation, police told the media that they had looked at hundreds of potential suspects, but there was only one that they could not rule out, and he was not cooperating with the investigation and only communicating with them through his attorney. Of course, that's pretty standard practice today, as even if you're completely innocent, most experts would advise you not to allow yourself to be questioned by law enforcement without an attorney present. But back in 1966, this was still a relatively new concept to many people. 3 months before this crime took place, the United States Supreme Court made their landmark decision, Miranda v. Arizona, in which they ruled that law enforcement must warn a person about their constitutional rights before interrogating them, or else that person's statements cannot be used as evidence against them at trial. In retrospect, it's a bit cringeworthy to go back and look at the original press coverage of the Bricca case and see a number of law enforcement officials complaining about the Miranda decision and how it was making it difficult for them to do their jobs and hampering their ability to solve this case. But of course, even if you believe Leininger was guilty of this crime, he still had the constitutional right not to speak with the police, and if he was actually innocent, then the Miranda decision may have prevented him from being railroaded. At the time, law enforcement would not publicly name their prime suspect in this case, though if you lived in Bridgetown and were familiar with many of the central players, you probably would have been able to put 2 and 2 together and figure out who they were referring to. The first time Leininger's name was ever released publicly was in 2009, 5 years after his death, when J.T. Townsend published a book titled Queen City Gothic, Cincinnati's Most Infamous Murder Mysteries, and devoted a chapter to the Bricca murders and confirmed that Leininger was the police's #1 suspect. In September of 2016, the Cincinnati-based television station WCPO-TV produced a 50-year anniversary news segment about the Bricca murders, and this marked the first time that a media outlet revealed that Leininger had been a suspect. And of course, when J.T. Townsend decided to devote an entire book to this case and publish Summer's Almost Gone in 2018, he was able to provide a full accounting of the original investigation against Leininger. Summer's Almost Gone is a very detailed book which contains pretty much every available piece of information about this crime, even the false leads and red herrings. It also provides a full account of the investigation to capture the serial killer known as the Cincinnati Strangler, who was operating in the area at the same time the Bricca murders took place. From December of 1965 until December of 1966, a total of 7 women were murdered by this assailant, and 5 of them were sexually assaulted. The Bricca murders just happened to take place in between the Strangler's 4th and 5th slaying, so naturally, investigators looked into the possibility that the crimes were connected. By the end of the year, law enforcement believed they had identified the Strangler as 29-year-old Posteel Lasky Jr., and he was charged and convicted for the murder of one of his victims, 31-year-old Barbara Bowman. Lasky was sentenced to death for the crime, though it was later commuted to life imprisonment, and he died behind bars in 2007. Lasky was never formally charged or convicted for the murders of the Strangler's other 6 victims, but since the slayings came to an end following Lasky's arrest, the authorities were confident that he was responsible for all the crimes. But it appears that Lasky was completely ruled out as a suspect in the Bricca murders, as the crime obviously did not fit his MO. While Barbara Bowman was fatally stabbed, much like the Briccas, Lasky's preferred method of murder was obviously strangulation. And even though Barbara Bowman was 31, Lasky liked to target middle-aged or elderly women, as the age range for his other victims was between 51 and 81. There was nothing in Lasky's background to suggest that he would target families, so it seems like it's just a tragic coincidence that the Briccas were killed at the same time a serial killer just happened to be carrying out a series of murders in Cincinnati. In addition to devoting a considerable amount of pages to the Strangler investigation, J.T. Townsend also uses his book to debunk some of the other so-called leads which have been associated with this case. Now, this is actually not the first time I've ever mentioned the Bricca murders on this podcast, as I briefly referenced it over 6 years ago on episode number 66, when I covered the unsolved murder of Valerie Percy. As a recap, Valerie was the 21-year-old daughter of Illinois senatorial candidate Charles Percy and was bludgeoned and stabbed to death inside her bedroom at her family's affluent home in Kenilworth, Illinois on September the 18th, 1966. Of course, this took place exactly 1 week before the Briccas were killed, and even though Kenilworth is located over 300 miles away from Bridgetown, it also only happens to be about 30 miles east of Barrington Hills, Illinois, the affluent suburb where Linda Bricca was born and grew up with her family. It's been reported that Linda and Valerie Percy may have run in the same social circles and possibly even met each other, and there were unconfirmed rumors that after Valerie's murder took place and made the news, Linda told some people that they went to the same high school together. However, Townsend explores this angle in Summer's Already Gone and confirms that Linda and Valerie went to separate high schools, and there's no evidence they ever knew each other at all. If you go back and listen to my episode about the Percy case, you'll know that it contains its own set of potential suspects and motives which have nothing to do with the Bricca case. So even though these 2 crimes just happen to take place in the Midwest within the same 1-week period, I see zero reason to believe they're connected. And there have also been attempts to link this case to a crime which took place in Seattle in 1966. 3 months before the Bricca murders, during the early morning hours of June the 23rd, 20-year-old Lonnie Trumbull and 20-year-old Lisa Wick were bludgeoned with a piece of lumber while they were sleeping inside their basement apartment. Lonnie was pronounced dead at the scene, but Lisa was still alive and had to undergo emergency brain surgery. She remained in a coma for a month, but managed to pull through, and it's believed that the heavy hair curlers that Lisa was wearing to bed may have softened the blows from the lumber and saved her life. Lisa provided a description of her attacker, whom she said was around 30 years old and had thinning blonde hair, but as the years went on, she came to believe that he might have been none other than Ted Bundy, who was a 19-year-old college student at that time and supposedly worked at a drugstore 4 blocks away from the apartment. But of course, Bundy did not match Lisa's original description of the perpetrator, and even though he was interviewed about this case on death row prior to his execution in 1989, Bundy denied any involvement. The crime was never officially solved, but it sounds like the best suspect was the son of the apartment building's landlord, as he took his own life several months later, and a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about the case was found in his possessions. Now, the reason this crime has been linked to the Bricca case is because both these victims were stewardesses with United Airlines, and as you might recall, Linda had worked that same job while living in Seattle before she married Jerry. It's been reported by some sources that Linda knew Lisa and Lonnie, and she supposedly told one of her neighbors that she helped break up a drug ring during her time at United Airlines, leading to speculation that these crimes might somehow be connected. However, Townsend completely debunks this in Summer's Almost Gone, as Lisa and Lonnie had only been working for United Airlines for 6 weeks at the time they were attacked, and were both still in high school when Linda moved away from Seattle in 1961. In fact, after the Seattle attack took place, Linda's mother sent her a letter containing newspaper clippings about the crime and asked if she knew the two victims, but Linda confirmed she did not. So yes, I think we can safely rule out the possibility that this crime had nothing to do with the Bricca murders, and the timing is nothing more than a coincidence. In his book, Townsend discounts some of the other wild theories which have been associated with this case, such as the murders being drug-related or some sort of mafia hit, or the family being killed because Jerry had uncovered some incriminating information at his job with Monsanto. Hell, there was even speculation that the Zodiac killer may have been responsible for the crime, but that was easily dismissed. But surprisingly, one theory which Townsend does not completely discount involves a satanic cult. The story goes that this cult sacrificed animals and worked with veterinarians, and Fred Leininger was supplying them with drugs, and the Briccas wound up being eliminated because Linda was about to turn them in. As ridiculous as this whole scenario sounds, Townsend stated during an interview, quote, "I had 7 different people that didn't know each other, 7 people unrelated to each other, name this individual as the man who got rid of Linda Bricca because she was about to expose what the group was doing." To cut through the rumors of this case really takes a disciplined mind, but if you saw my reaction about the satanic cult when I first got it, I'm not laughing about that now, because there's too many credible things that have shown up. End quote. Well, that's certainly surprising to hear, but while I wouldn't necessarily say that I believe the satanic cult theory, another possibility which Townsend subscribes to, and shouldn't be completely discounted, is that multiple people were involved in these murders, and it could have been a hired hit. Townsend seems to put some stock into the 2 eyewitness accounts of the 2 men and a woman climbing into a white or green car parked on Greenway Avenue outside the Bricca residence at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murders. Granted, it was a dark and rainy night, so these witnesses could have misconstrued what they saw. These 3 people were never identified or interviewed, so for all we know, they may have been nothing more than innocent bystanders, though it does seem like quite a coincidence that they were seen near a house where a triple homicide took place during the approximate time period the victims were believed to have been killed. But if these 3 people were involved, what could their motive have been, and how does Fred Leininger fit into the whole situation? Ever since the early stages of the investigation, it seems like the primary theory is that the murders were somehow connected to Linda having an affair with Leininger. I'll once again throw in the disclaimer that it was never conclusively proven that they had an affair, but there is ample evidence pointing in that direction. It's obvious that the Bricca's marriage was not a happy one, and if Jerry and Linda had not been murdered, who knows how much longer the relationship would have lasted. Linda was only 18 years old when she married Jerry, and they had been together only 4 months, and you get the sense that this marriage may have just been done out of some sort of obligation since Linda became pregnant with Debbie. Lisa had just gotten a job as a flight attendant, which would have given her the opportunity to travel around the world and do a number of potentially exciting things, but now she was being forced to become a stay-at-home housewife and mother. Jerry appeared to be a workaholic, and his fellow employees described him as being a bit of a perfectionist with a short temper, and because he worked such long hours, Linda barely saw him. It sounds like Jerry wanted to have another child, but Linda was against the idea, and seemed more interested in adopting additional pets. Linda seemed like someone who bonded better with animals than people, and even though she tried joining a social group called the Monsanto Wives Club, she never really fit in with the other women there, most of whom were years older than her. Since Linda's biggest passion was animals, she wanted to become a veterinarian or possibly open her own clinic someday, but Jerry just wanted her to stay home and take care of their daughter. Given the circumstances, it's not hard to imagine Linda deciding to have an extramarital affair, particularly with a man like Fred Leininger, who worked in the field that she was most passionate about. We know that Linda had been taking her dogs to the Glenway Animal Hospital for treatment since November of 1963, and had apparently been inquiring about getting a job there for several months, so it might seem like quite a coincidence that Leininger finally offered her part-time work as a receptionist less than 1 week before she was killed. One of the earliest incidents, which suggested that Linda may have been cheating on her husband, occurred in April of 1966, 5 months before the murders. While Jerry was out of town on a business trip, Linda hired a babysitter named Susan Keller to watch over Debbie so that she could attend the Shrine Circus at the Cincinnati Gardens, as Linda said she had become friendly with one of the trainers and was going to help him take care of some of his animals. Late that evening, Linda phoned Susan to let her know that she was running late because of car trouble, and Jerry wound up returning from his business trip before Linda made it home. Shortly after midnight, Susan said that Linda finally arrived back at her residence and was being followed by a red car being driven by an unidentified man. Linda claimed this man had helped her start her car and followed her home to make sure she arrived okay, but when Jerry came outside to meet Linda, Susan said that he seemed quite angry. The couple then got into an argument before they went back into the house, and Susan saw the man in the red car drive away. This man was never identified, but it's worth noting that Fred Leininger drove a red station wagon. After the murders, detectives interviewed the animal trainer at the Shrine Circus, but when they showed him Linda's photograph, he denied knowing her and claimed he never would have allowed an outsider like her near his animals. Of course, this was not the only incident where Linda came home later than expected and angered her husband, so there's good reason to believe that she had been carrying on a secret affair for months. I know that Leininger aroused suspicion during his original interview with police because he neglected to mention some of his final interactions with Linda, such as their encounter at the Crescent Bowman Archery Club. While that does look pretty damning, you still have to ask yourself, was Leininger acting this way in order to cover up his complicity in the murders, or was he simply trying to cover up an extramarital affair? These days, an innocent person might be more inclined to be forthcoming with police in order to avoid becoming a suspect in a homicide, even if they had to confess that they had been cheating on their spouse. But back in 1966, this type of thing would probably have been a lot more scandalous, so Leininger may have felt he needed to avoid admitting to the affair at any cost in order to protect his reputation. Fred's wife, Lynn Leininger, never spoke publicly about the case and was not interviewed by law enforcement, but she was the one who informed them that if they wanted to keep questioning her husband, they would have to go through his attorney. I have no idea if Lynn believed Fred was having an affair, but I'm guessing she did not suspect he was involved in the murders, since she stuck by him and they remained together until their deaths in 2004. Now, obviously, it's pretty unsettling that the prime suspect in a crime like this would eventually decide to kill himself in what appeared to be a suicide pact with his wife, and you could read this as a sign that Fred was plagued with guilt over what he had done. But you have to remember that his suicide took place over 37 years after the murders, and there was nothing to indicate the investigation was heating up at that time and Leininger was in any danger of being arrested. At that point, Leininger had still not been publicly named as a suspect and had retired and moved away to Florida, and while the exact contents of Fred and Lynn's suicide note have never been released, I get the sense that their decision to take their own lives was related to health and financial issues rather than the Bricca murders. I will admit that it is a bit odd that they would travel all the way from Florida to Cincinnati in order to check into a hotel and go through with the act of ending their own lives, but as we've seen in so many other cases like this, sometimes suicidal people can be very unpredictable. It is a shame that Lynn never spoke about the case, because if she did, we might have had some insight on her husband's potential whereabouts on the night of the murders. During his initial interview with detectives, Leininger seemed unable to provide a solid alibi, as he said he may have gone into his clinic in order to treat an animal, but could not recall with any certainty. However, this doesn't seem to line up with the account from the married couple he hired, Stephen and Belinda Westman, who lived in the clinic's apartment and told police that they returned there at 6 p.m. that evening, but had no recollection of seeing Leininger. Obviously, the most likely place you would expect to find a family man like Leininger on a Sunday night is at home with his wife and children, but as far as I can tell, they've never commented on the situation in order to confirm if he was there or even returned home later than usual. The last time anyone from the Bricca family was confirmed to be alive was when Jerry was seen taking the garbage out to the curb at 9 p.m., but since neighbors reported hearing odd thumping noises from the Bricca residence between 9:15 and 9:30, there's a good chance the murders took place a short time after Jerry went back inside. That would fit with the timeline, because Jerry was still dressed in the same clothes he wore that day when he was killed, whereas Linda and Debbie were dressed in their night clothes. And since the television set was still on when their bodies were found, they obviously had not gone to sleep before they were killed. One odd detail is that Debbie was wearing one of her socks while the other was found on her bed, but this may be because her parents were in the midst of preparing to tuck her in before they were interrupted. Since there were no signs of forced entry, it's possible that the killer knocked on the door and was led inside the house, but both the front and back doors were found unlocked, and one neighbor even said that they noticed that the back door was wide open at around 9:15. Back in the 1960s, people were more prone to leaving their doors unlocked, so the killer may have simply walked inside on their own. That night, no one reported hearing any barking or noises from the two family dogs, Thumper and Daisy, even though they were known for being aggressive towards strangers. This means that the killer may have gone inside the residence on a previous occasion and was recognized by the dogs, which is why they didn't react. It's been theorized that the animals were drugged and then shuffled into the lower-level TV room in order to prevent them from intervening when the murders took place, but while no tests were performed to conclusively prove this, let's just assume this is true. Who would be more likely to have access to drugs which could sedate an animal than a veterinarian like Fred Leininger? And given that Leininger had treated Thumper and Daisy numerous times, and even made a house call to the Bricca residence at one point, the dogs were definitely familiar with him, and it's reasonable to assume that they would not have barked if he suddenly showed up inside their house. Another troubling detail which seems to incriminate Leininger is the eyewitness account from Larry Foppe, the liquor proprietor who claimed he saw Leininger frantically enter his store and attempt to use the payphone at around 10:30 that night. Since the store was located only a half-mile away from the Bricca residence, and the murders were believed to have taken place sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock, the timeline would match up if Leininger was the perpetrator. I have no idea who Leininger would have been attempting to call, but it sounds like he was in a frenzied mood and was unable to get through before he left. In Leininger's defense, police did suspect that the killer may have remained behind at the residence for a lengthy amount of time in order to clean it up, and I don't believe Foppe reported seeing any blood on Leininger, even though he would have just stabbed 3 people multiple times each. But of course, this doesn't preclude the idea of Leininger returning to the Bricca residence after frequenting the store. Once again, since Lynn Leininger was never questioned, we have no idea if and when her husband might have returned home that night. Foppe said that Leininger's odd behavior really bothered him even before he learned about the Bricca murders, but unfortunately, he waited a few weeks before he came forward and reported this incident to police. By this point, Leininger had already made the decision to stop speaking with investigators, so they never got the opportunity to question him about this alleged incident. Of course, eyewitnesses can be mistaken all the time, but Leininger was a regular customer who frequented the liquor store multiple times per week. I don't know the likelihood of Foppe mistaking him for someone else, though I guess you can't completely rule out the possibility that he was mistaken about the date this incident took place. But if Foppe's sighting is accurate, then what logical reason would Leininger have to use the phone at that particular time on that particular night? On the other hand, Foppe did provide a detail which would seem to point away from Leininger, because when he drove home a short time later, Foppe said that he passed by the Bricca residence and saw what appeared to be a blue car parked in front of Jerry's Volkswagen. And then 45 minutes later, we have the 2 witnesses who said they saw 2 men and a woman getting into a white or green car which was parked in this same approximate spot. While these sound like 2 entirely different cars, this was a dark night where it was raining pretty hard, so I suppose it's not impossible that someone could have been mistaken about the color. But the point is that Leininger drove a red station wagon at that time, and Foppe even said that he saw him driving away in this vehicle when he left the liquor store. As far as I can tell, no witnesses ever reported seeing a red station wagon near the Bricca residence that night, so there is technically nothing to place Leininger at or near the murder scene. Another source of confusion in this case is whether the Monday morning edition of the Cincinnati Enquirer was delivered to the Bricca residence, as it was not among the pile of newspapers found in their yard when their bodies were discovered on Tuesday night. The courier was certain that he dropped off the Monday morning edition at 2:15 a.m., and I guess it's possible that someone with no connection to the murders could have stolen the paper from the yard before the bodies were discovered late Tuesday night. Regardless, it's been theorized that the killer could have picked up the paper when they left the scene and used it to wrap up the murder weapon before they got rid of it. But if so, then that would mean the killer was inside the residence for around 4 or 5 hours after the murders took place, even though Leininger was seen in the liquor store at 10:30 p.m., and the two men and the woman were seen climbing into their car at 11:30. But of course, the theory about the newspaper is based on nothing more than speculation and could have no relevance to this case. Even if other people could be placed at the Bricca residence after Leininger frequented the liquor store, that doesn't necessarily clear him, as rumors have always circulated that he did not act alone and could have even hired someone to kill the family. This next part is based on nothing more than rumors and hearsay, but in Summer's Almost Gone, Townsend lists a couple of friends and associates of Leininger's who were pushed forward as potential candidates to have assisted him with the murders. One of them was Dr. Stanley Keller, a fellow veterinarian who owned another animal hospital in the city and had been admitted to a psychiatric ward on at least 3 prior occasions for depression and suicidal thoughts, though there was nothing to indicate he had any propensity for violence. Another veterinarian who was friends with Leininger was Dr. Herman Rader, who did relief work for him at the Glenway Animal Hospital on several occasions, and even spoke with Linda there 4 days before she was killed. Like Keller, Rader previously had spent time in a psychiatric ward, but unlike Keller, he had a previous history of violence, which included stabbing or attempting to stab other men. Leininger also happened to be friends with Glenn Skipper Ryle, who hosted a Cincinnati-based children's television show named The Skipper Ryle Show, which ran for 17 years and turned him into a local celebrity, so much so that Ryle even has his own Wikipedia page. In fact, Leininger even appeared as a guest on the show on a few occasions in order to discuss caring for animals. I should add that there's zero evidence linking Ryle to these murders, and nothing to indicate that he had a violent streak, but rumors apparently did circulate about his potential involvement. While working on his book, J.T. Townsend received this email from a former Bridgetown resident who wrote, quote, "The thought was that Dr. Leininger was covering up for the skipper. The rumor was so strong that many of us young mothers would not let our kids watch Skipper Ryle's program anymore," end quote. But I don't know, we are talking about a crime in which an entire family was murdered and a 4-year-old girl was stabbed 4 times. Why would anyone agree to participate in a crime like this or help cover it up, unless they had some sort of deep-seated hatred towards the victims? So it's always been theorized that Jerry and/or Linda were the killer's intended target, but Debbie was murdered because she was a witness who would have recognized the perpetrator. I know that eyewitness accounts from 4-year-olds can be iffy as evidence, since their brains are not fully developed and their recollections may not be accurate, but Debbie was described as being a very bright and precocious child for her age, so if she provided a positive identification of the killer, it probably would have been considered to be credible. We know that Linda took Debbie to the Glenway Animal Hospital on many prior occasions, so the child definitely knew who Dr. Leininger was, and by Leininger's own admission, he stopped by the Bricca residence to return a book to Debbie 2 days before she was killed. In fact, Debbie was apparently so familiar with Leininger that numerous people told police that she had started calling him Uncle Fred. But once again, Leininger did not have any known history of violence, so how did things escalate to the point where he decided to commit a triple homicide? How does a father of 5 children make the decision to brutally stab another child? Well, 2 possibilities are that Linda told Leininger she wanted to end the affair, which caused him to snap and kill her and her entire family, or she threatened to expose the affair and he decided that he needed to silence her in order to preserve his reputation. But if you look at their known movements in the days prior to the murders, neither of these scenarios seems to make 100% complete sense. We know that Leininger offered Linda a part-time job at his clinic on Monday the 19th, and she worked there for the next 3 days. When Linda worked her shift on Wednesday the 21st, she came home later than usual that night with whiskey on her breath, which caused Jerry to become suspicious. We also know that Linda was trying to find a babysitter for Debbie on the evening of Thursday the 22nd because Leininger had supposedly called her into work, even though the clinic closed at noon that day. She then left a message with an answering service requesting that Leininger urgently call her, but when he was asked about this during his police interview, Leininger had no recollection of ever hearing the message. On Friday the 23rd, we have the account from Robert Gurton, who was at the Crescent Bowman Archery Club with Leininger, and claimed that Linda suddenly showed up there and started hanging out with them, which seemed to make Leininger visibly uncomfortable. And the following day, Saturday the 24th, we have 2 witnesses who recalled seeing Linda in a car being driven by a man who was not her husband, and one of the witnesses picked Leininger out of a photo lineup. It's worth noting that these witnesses did not describe the car as being a red station wagon, which Leininger was known to be driving at the time, but they did say that the vehicle was light gray or green, which seems to match the description of the car that the 2 men and the woman were seen climbing into outside the Bricca residence the following evening. Let's also not forget that traces of semen were found inside Linda's body at the time of her death, which did not match Jerry's blood type. Since it did not appear that she had been raped, it's been speculated that Linda had consensual sex with someone 24 to 36 hours prior to her death, which fit the time frame of when she was allegedly seen with Leininger. But if Leininger was the killer, what could have happened during this final encounter which compelled him to commit murder? After all, he made a phone call to the Bricca residence earlier that morning in order to inform Linda that he was hiring her to work every Wednesday at his clinic, so there didn't appear to be any noticeable warning signs that something was wrong. What's odd about this whole situation is that Jerry had received a verbal offer for a new job in San Francisco, which was scheduled to begin sometime in October, so there was a chance the family would be moving again, and Linda could not work her new receptionist job for very much longer. It's unclear if Leininger was aware of this, but if the Briccas were planning to leave the state, then there would be less reason for him to be paranoid about the affair being exposed. But alternatively, if he wanted a long-term future with Linda, perhaps Leininger became angry when he learned that she wasn't planning to leave her family for him and would instead make the move to San Francisco. While it does not sound like the Briccas' marriage was in the best place at that time, Linda may have been willing to stick it out with Jerry if it meant leaving Ohio, where she had always been unhappy. We seem to have a pretty full accounting of Jerry's whereabouts on Sunday the 25th, as he was seen going to work, attending church, and running a number of different errands. While it seems like Linda remained at home with Debbie the entire day, it's unclear if she had any further communication with Leininger, and we don't know much about his whereabouts that day either. You'll notice that I've spent the majority of this episode outlining scenarios in which Leininger is the perpetrator, but that's because very few plausible alternate scenarios have been presented. I'm hoping that investigators didn't get tunnel vision in regards to Leininger, as it's certainly possible that Jerry may have been the intended target all along rather than Linda. Jerry did have a few potential enemies, including a couple of co-workers he did not get along with, but investigators did look into a number of different suspects, and the only one they could not completely rule out was Leininger. Even though a number of drawers in the residence had been pulled out, I do think the scene was staged in order to create the false impression of a robbery gone wrong. Nothing valuable appeared to have been stolen, and while Jerry's wallet was empty, we don't know how much money was in there to begin with. While there have always been rumors that the crime was a hired hit, one detail which I feel might go against that scenario is the fact that the murder weapon may have originated from the home. Yes, I'll throw in the disclaimer that we still can't be 100% certain what the murder weapon was, but it seems very likely that it was a missing carving knife from a set that the Briccas owned, as it measured around 6.5 inches, which was the approximate length of most of the wounds found on the victims' bodies. When police searched the house, they found the knife set inside an open drawer, but people who had frequented the residence on previous occasions said that the Briccas usually kept the set on display in the dining room, so the killer may have moved it into the drawer after committing the crime. Whatever the case, if someone entered the residence with the intention of killing someone, you would think that they would have brought their own murder weapon with them, rather than using an item that was already inside the home. That's why I'm not discounting the possibility that the murders were a crime of passion that were not planned ahead of time, and the killer grabbed one of the carving knives because the set was out on display in the open, and it was the first weapon they could find. If it was Fred Leininger, could it be possible that he went to the house with the intention of confronting Jerry and/or Linda about something, but then things escalated into violence? But on the other hand, the one piece of evidence which points to this crime being premeditated was the adhesive medical tape found dangling from Jerry's chin. As far as I can tell, there was no other tape like that found in the Bricca residence, and it was the type of tape which could be used in veterinarians' offices. Why would someone even bother bringing that to the scene unless they were planning something nefarious? Now, I know that a lot of the physical evidence collected from the scene back in 1966 may have been compromised and not properly preserved or stored, but there is at least some DNA evidence since it was entered into CODIS and failed to yield a match. Since Fred Leininger was never arrested and charged with anything during his lifetime, his DNA is obviously not going to be in CODIS. During the original investigation, detectives took the initiative to collect samples of Leininger's hair from a hat that he wore, but while they obviously couldn't DNA test it back then, they apparently still do have these hair samples inside an evidence bag, and I was curious to know if investigators were planning to go the genetic genealogy route to see if his DNA might be at the scene. In a news report from February of 2020, Hamilton County prosecutor Joe Dieters said that every piece of evidence in the Bricca case was being retested, but an ancestry group was unable to find a DNA match with the materials. He said some hairs were going to be tested soon, and while I haven't heard anything since then, Dieter said that if they got a DNA match to a suspect that was already deceased, he would be willing to exhume their body. But even so, would this evidence be strong enough to conclusively prove that Leininger, or anyone else for that matter, committed these murders? If the DNA from the semen inside Linda's body matched Leininger, that would likely not prove anything, since it's very plausible that he could have had consensual sex with her the previous day. There were cigarette butts found at the scene, which likely did not belong to Jerry and Linda since they were non-smokers, but the presence of someone's DNA on them would only prove that they smoked inside the house at one point, not that they killed anyone. The most potentially compelling evidence is the strand of hair found in Linda's right hand, but even though it was supposedly compared with the samples of Leininger's hair, I don't believe a match was ever made. And while researching his book, Townsend claimed that he was told by a detective the hair was, quote-unquote, most likely from a relative. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Office has confirmed that this is still an open, active investigation, and as we've seen in recent years, DNA testing and genetic genealogy do make it possible for these older cold cases to be solved, even when the perpetrator is likely deceased. Overall, I do think the most logical scenario is that Fred Leininger was the killer, but I wouldn't say I'm 100% certain, since there are still a lot of unanswered questions about motive and how this crime was carried out, and if more than one person was involved. For all we know, perhaps the evidence will eventually be linked to a suspect who is yet to pop up on the radar. In any event, if you happen to have any information about the Bricca Family Murders, please contact the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigation Section at 513-851-6000. That's 513-851-6000. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about an infamous case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1994 disappearance of Tina Marcotte, and the subsequent death of the prime suspect, Tom Keeter, who supposedly ended his own life by allowing his head to be crushed with a forklift. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover an unsolved missing persons case, the 1989 disappearance of Melanie Melanson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are John G., Angie S., Bethany F., Jay Chips, Lori B., and Julie M. Thank you all so much for your support. I wanted to remind everyone that in just over 1 month, The Trail Went Cold will be traveling to London to appear on Podcast Row at the CrimeCon UK event, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COOL24. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COOL24 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.